Okay, so you turn this up. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ann Grimes. I'm the Associate Director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, which, for those of you who don't know, is a bi-coastal institute anchored at in Stanford School of Engineering and at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. We're delighted that you could join us today for what no doubt will be a really interesting discussion about what big tech's monopoly powers mean for our culture. We are delighted and want to thank our co-sponsor for today's event, the Freeman Spogli Institute's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is headed by Frank Fukuyama. Thank you, Frank, and thank you to the Center for taking the lead in bringing Franklin to campus. Both Brown and CCDRL are hosting speaker series this fall, so let me just tell you a little bit about that. Upcoming events, there are 8 for CCDRL, and they include on Thursday, this Thursday the 28th, there will be a talk by visiting scholar Andrea Everett called Humanitarian Hypocrisy, Civilian Protection, and the Design of Peace Operations. On October 3rd, there will be the launch of the Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Program. On October 4th, Steve Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations will discuss whatever happened to the Arab Spring. And then on November 16th, there'll be a discussion about online disinformation with Kate Starberg, who is an engineering professor at the University of Washington. So please go to the center's website and get a complete listing. The Brown Institute also will be hosting 2 special events this quarter. On October 11th, we'll be talking with podcaster Dan Carlin, so we hope you all can make it for that. And on November 14th, Richard Gingras, who is Vice President of News at Google, will join us for a discussion about media and trust. So again, with thanks to Frank and CCDRL today, we are kicking off, Brown is kicking off also our fall seminar series, and this is part of it, examining media innovation. These seminars also will be running through December 5th, and you can see the complete listing at our website, which is brown.stanford.edu, or under the class listing CS 581. So those of you who are in CS 581, raise your hands. Okay, you're all here. Good. If you haven't signed in, please do. Note that if you have to leave early to catch another class, be quiet when you do. We're going to have a videotape of the full interview up tonight on the class website, so if you have to leave early to catch another class, you can catch the full video tonight. And then note that next week's talk will be back in Gates in the Brown Institute space. So there's that. So first, let me introduce Frank Fukuyama, who is the senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and professor by courtesy of political science. As I said, Frank also serves as director of SFI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. For those of you who don't know, it is a center that bridges the worlds of scholarship, policy, and practice to understand and advance the conditions for just, democratic, and sustainable development around the world. Frank has written widely on issues relating to questions concerning democratization and international political economy. His many books include The End of History and The Last Man, and Falling Behind, Explaining the Development Gap Between Latin America and the United States, most recently. So thank you so much. Franklin Foer, our speaker, as you know, has just published World Without Mind. Note that books are for sale outside the door, and we hope you will take advantage of that. The book tackles a very big topic, the existential threat of big tech. One recent review of the book ran a headline summing it up like this, quote, "Silicon Valley will lead us to our doom." Franklin is a national correspondent for The Atlantic, where he has written on a wide range of topics. He also is a fellow at the New American Foundation. For 7 years, he served as editor of The New Republic. He also has written for Slate and New York Magazine. His previous book, How Soccer Explains the World, has been translated into 27 languages and was the winner of a National Jewish Book Award. He is a graduate of Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming two Franks. And I will pass the baton. Here we go. You take that, and you take that.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, and especially to be in conversation with Frank, who is, to me, the definition of the public intellectual, which I know is a bit of a term that's taken a lot of abuse over the years. But I've learned a lot from reading you, and also just the model of engagement that you provided for the rest of us. So it's a real treat and honor to be with you, and it's a treat and honor to be with you here today, where I think we have two different thematic audiences that overlap at the core of my argument, which is that we have a lot of people here who are practitioners of journalism and who are studying journalism and thinking deeply about the future of our profession. And then we have people who come from the world of studying democracy. And this last election was, I think, a wake-up call, in that I think we had a sense that our public square had started to decay, and that we'd gone through all these convulsions with the way that information is created and consumed, but we really hadn't been able to tally up the toll of that revolution, to really make sense of whether it was steering us in a direction that was leading us to some superior place, or whether it was endangering our republic. And I started off writing this book long before the election. I started off writing this book because of my own experience. It started with my own experiences as a writer and my experiences within journalism, where I could see the ways in which the professions that I inhabited had become increasingly dependent on the big tech companies. That when I started off in journalism, it was a very, very different sort of profession. And I don't want to sound totally nostalgic for it, because there was a lot that was wrong with journalism as a profession, and there was a lot that was great about the convulsions that happened to journalism over time. But let me just begin by just giving you kind of just narrating my own story, and I think that'll get us into some of the bigger questions. Which was, so I had been the editor of I'd been the editor of a little magazine called The New Republic, which was based in Washington and was squarely aimed at an elite audience. That there was I read a book, a history of the 1960s, that was describing what it meant to be a liberal, and it was describing the importance of New Republic to the way that liberals conceived of themselves. And it noted that all the readers of the New Republic couldn't have filled the University of Mississippi football stadium. And the magazine was pretty explicit in aiming it to that small group. And we published insider political stuff and long cultural essays. And it was this alchemy that you would never create today. And it kind of had this cultish following. And we really struggled with the convulsions of the internet, because if we had been self-consciously elitist, here you had blogging and this revolution where where information was being radically democratized, and we struggled to figure out how to make sense of what our place was in this new world. And journalism itself had just taken so many hits over the course of the 2000s that the advertising market had collapsed after the recession of 2000, and advertising just didn't come back, and there was so much uncertainty about where to direct things. And it's hard to overstate the toll that that time took on professional journalism, that we shed a tremendous number of editors and reporters in a very, very short period of time. And the percentages that newsrooms collapsed is kind of astonishing. And so for a couple years, as I was editing the magazine, we were in search constantly of new benefactors. So I was always trucking up to New York to try to hoodwink some investment banker or another into investing in our little magazine by telling them that it was going to eventually make money, even though I knew that that wasn't really going to be the case. And it was a fairly exhausting process. And I stepped down as editor in 2010. And then, to my astonishment, a savior appeared on the scene. And his name was Chris Hughes. And he was a roommate of Mark Zuckerberg's at Harvard. And he was Facebook employee number 3. And he'd become fantastically wealthy. He had $700 million when he bought the New Republic, and he claimed that he was committed to all the serious things that we'd been historically committed to, and that he was going to invest in them. And because he'd invented social media, he knew how to make these old forms viable in a new era. And so it was tremendously exciting to me. When he asked me to come back and be editor, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. And so for the first couple of years, we started. It was exhilarating. We tried to create a website that was almost an anti-website, where most websites are scroll down forever. We wanted to create something that had finitude and hierarchy, and took the values of magazine journalism and inserted them into this new form. And it was all great until it wasn't. And the moment it ceased being great was when Chris realized how much money he was spending, and he said, we need to correct for this instantaneously, which was entirely predictable. But nonetheless, it was quite shocking when it happened. And so Chris said, look, in order to turn around revenue, it's very simple. You need traffic. And the only way that you can get traffic is by producing things that flourish on Facebook. And fortunately, I invented Facebook. And so here's how it works. And so the New Republic, it should be said, was kind of, in a lot of ways, a terrible host for injecting this Facebook sort of mentality into things. But he was convinced that there was a way to square the circle. But he kept talking about how we needed to produce snackable content. And so, which is really one of the worst terms I think you could possibly come up with. But the idea was that, all right, you have to create things that people would want to read on their phones, on Facebook, while they're standing on a subway platform, killing time, trying to decompress from work or what have you. And that the primary thing that we needed to do was to listen to the data. And so he installed a data guru on our staff. And the point was that Facebook was an environment that could be mastered. That Facebook was a place where you could manipulate people into clicking. You needed to write the right headline, you needed to put the right photo on, and you needed to tap into people's emotions. And I'm sure that this is starting to sound a little bit ominously familiar when we start with overtones with what Russians and various other bad actors started to do in this last election, which is that Facebook is a giant feedback loop. Facebook gives you what you want, because Facebook has collected a tremendous trove of data about everywhere you've traveled across the web, the things that you've read, the things that you've purchased. It's combined with other troves of data, including data that comes from stores that are offline. And data is essentially a portrait of your psyche, of your habits, of your patterns, of your pleasures and your fears. And if you take that data and you leverage it in a way to try to addict people, which is what Facebook does, Facebook aims to create an environment where you stick around on their site for as long as possible. And so it's devised its algorithms, these invisible rules that provide hierarchy to information in order to sort that information in a way that keeps you on their site forever and ever. And so at the New Republic, we set about doing that. And some of it is very trivial. It means that you gravitate towards a thing that's trending on Facebook. Facebook has a list of features that are trending, and it creates a sort of convergence. And so one of the arguments in my book that I'll explain in a second is the ways in which these technologies, which seem to be promoting individuality on its surface, are actually promoting a form of conformism ultimately. And this is what I experienced myself, and I've seen in other places, is that you gravitate towards the thing that is popular because you want to skim that popularity for yourself. And so there's an example I give in my book, which was that there was a picture of a Minnesota dentist who'd killed a lion who happened to be a celebrity lion called Cecil. And every website, the New Yorker, the New York Times, Vox, even people who were very high-minded gravitated towards this subject and tried to put their own twist on it in order to benefit from the popularity of the subject. And there were ultimately 3.2 million stories written about Cecil the lion. Now that's a fairly trivial example, but the same thing happens with our politics. And this is where we start to get to the questions about democracy. And so the New Republic was a quirky magazine which positioned itself on the center left, but always published people who were on the center right or maybe to the left. And that was part of what we did. And being heterodox was a point of pride at the New Republic, maybe to a fault. But what happens politically is that when you see what's popular, and if your goal is to become popular, I don't care how high-minded you are, and I don't care whatever checks and balances you put in that system, you are going to gravitate towards the popular. Data is a Pandora's box. Once you open it, and once you know what works, it's hard to shut it. You're always going to do what works because the goal is to win. The goal is to get revenue. The goal is to amass audience. And so politically, I actually found it to be an incredibly distorting phenomenon. And I'm not proud of the ways in which it's distorting, but I think you have to only be human to see the ways in which it has its effect, which was that, I found myself pulling the magazine further and further to the left, in part because I believed in some of those issues, but in part the data was suggesting that was the place to go, and that publishing pieces by people who disagreed with our readers were just ineffective, that they just wouldn't yield the same sort of popularity. And so this is what I think the ultimate toll of Facebook is on our profession, but not just on our profession, on our democracy and our politics, which is that everything has become super polarized in our world. But within that frame of polarization, what you have is two hive minds that have been created and that Facebook has nurtured and created feedback loops that create what's been called filter bubbles, where people hear what they want to hear. And in this last election, we saw the ways in which that's incredibly dangerous, because when you hear what you want to hear, it makes you extremely vulnerable to fake news, propaganda, demagogic appeals. And it's not just on the right. I see this also on the left when it comes to, and I've written Russia-Trump collaboration reporting, and I it's another subject. I believe that there's something there, but I've also seen the ways in which there are conspiracy theorists on the left who go way, way beyond the evidence and spread misinformation or bad information, and the ways in which they're greeted with open arms by people because they tell them what they want to hear. And so from this experience, so the experience at the New Republic ended very badly for me in the end, where Chris hired a CEO from Yahoo, and as soon as he came in, I kind of knew I was doomed, and that he was going to bring in his own person, because that's what CEOs from Yahoo do as recreationally, I guess. As a matter of good practice, they fire the person who's there before. But what ended up happening at the New Republic was that it became a kind of a parable or a case study, maybe even in some way unfairly, about the clash between Silicon Valley and its increasingly outsized role in journalism, and journalists who just couldn't get with the program, or didn't want to get with the program. And so when I actually resigned before I was fired, because that's a big distinction. I'll just tell the story really, really quickly, even though it's irrelevant. When Chris was going to fire me, he didn't tell anybody he was going to fire me, but he'd hired my replacement, and my replacement was walking around New York offering people jobs at the New Republic. And so, of course, that got back to me before Chris could bring me into his office to fire me. And so, as soon as I heard this, I said, "Well, here's I'm writing my resignation letter, and I'm gonna publicly quit rather than be privately fired." And so, I gathered the staff and I told them what was happening and told them that I was leaving, and Chris was completely blindsided by this. And when I quit, 12 other writers at the magazine also quit, and it kind of blew up into a story that, like I said, became a flashpoint in this whole controversy. But my story kind of led me into the bigger story, and the bigger story is this: we've always had monopolies in America. We've always had big companies. We've always been comfortable with those big companies on the one hand, because they provide us with efficiency and low prices, but we've also harbored a fear of private power, just as there's an American tradition of harboring a fear of public power. And these companies represent a unique challenge to us, to us as citizens. And the challenge is this: that these companies, we've always had technology, and the inventions that these companies have brought us are truly incredible. Phones, the iPhone is one of the great achievements of humankind. Google is one of the great achievements of humankind. That you can type in any question into a search engine and get information back within a millisecond is astonishing. And we should be proud of those accomplishments. But the magical qualities of those accomplishments doesn't mean that we should turn off of our skepticism. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask questions of these companies. We've always had tools. And those tools have automated human behavior. But what's being automated right now is different than upper body strength. It's different than our ability to plow fields. Our intellectual functions are being automated. That these companies filter our reality. They shape our reality because they shape our consumption of news and information. And soon they're going to be shaping virtual realities that we're going to be inhabiting. These companies view themselves as having no boundaries because the internet has no boundaries. The internet is everything, really. And these companies aspire to be everything companies. Amazon was once the everything store, but that's too narrow for Amazon. So now it powers the cloud. It's a movie studio. It's a newspaper. It's Whole Foods. Google once set out to organize knowledge, and now Google is a life sciences company that wants to defeat death. And the question is, should there be limits imposed on these companies? should society be comfortable with the power that exists within them? And my argument is that we need countervailing powers, that we can't allow these powers to exist unimpeded, because there's too much at stake. We're changing in very, very fundamental ways. As we merge with these machines, we're changing as human beings. And the problem is we're not just merging with machines, we're also merging with the companies that operate those machines. And so we're crossing thresholds. Privacy may be done already. I hope it's not. I believe that it's possible to preserve some sort of conception of privacy, but we're very close to crossing a threshold where it may not be preservable. There are institutions that we care about that are highly vulnerable and are in the process of being changed. And are we going to simply accept their disappearance? The very definition of what it means to be a human being is in the process of flux, because we're wearing technologies now, and it's not a stretch to imagine that they're going to be implanted within us someday. And so just because the stakes are so high, and because a lot of things that we accepted as being permanent and fixed, like our democracy, seem now to be much more vulnerable than we ever thought that they were. And so rather than just drift into a future where we just kind of we accept things as inevitable, or we accept things as we come, we need to remember that we have the ability to shape our destinies. And you're reminded of it constantly in small sorts of ways. So last week, London pushed back against Uber. Now, maybe London will never kick out Uber, and maybe London shouldn't kick out Uber, but Uber's never had that kind of pressure applied to it. Uber has behaved in a lawless sort of way in a lot of jurisdictions, and Uber's treated workers pretty terribly. And so the fact that London's putting pressure on Uber will have the effect of changing Uber's behavior. Mark Zuckerberg has never been called to account for fake news or the way that his system operates. He should be asked to testify before the United States Senate about these things. Or just this is not tech, but it was pretty inspiring to watch the Take a Knee protest against Donald Trump, because you rarely see that kind of collective action materialize in such a spontaneous, widespread sort of way. And it's just an example of how sometimes we as human beings rate ourselves so low. We don't think that we have the ability to assert ourselves over the narrative, but we can.
Okay, thank you. So the point is to open this up to a larger discussion, but I want to say a couple of different things. Larry Diamond, seated next to me, and I both have new projects that look at this whole interrelationship between social media and democracy, not just here in the United States, but around the world as well. And so we've been thinking about this a lot. I've not had a chance to actually buy your book and read it, but I've read a lot of. I will buy a copy. I've read a lot of the reviews, and I'm very sympathetic to the overall point that these companies are really, really big and powerful, and that in itself is a challenge to democracy. There's two specific examples of that exercise of power recently. The first one was what Amazon did to Hachette. Mm-hmm. Where Hachette was a smaller publisher that didn't want to go along with their ebook pricing policy, and Amazon used its monopoly power to cut them out of the market, because if you can't sell books on Amazon, you can't sell books. And I actually joined this author's revolt, against Amazon, because I thought this was exactly what was going to happen if this company got, larger and larger. It would use its monopoly power not to benefit consumers, but to hurt them. And the second one is the one that just happened a month ago at New America, where we both have an association. If you're following that story, they had a group that was complaining about bigness of companies, and the director of the program posted a blog post supporting the European Union's attempt, anti-monopoly fine of Google, and as a result, that entire group was fired overnight because Google was on the board. Eric Schmidt was on the board of Google and didn't like that. Evidently, I mean, I have no inside information other than what I read in the newspaper.
I have inside information, and your account is accurate.
So I think that those are some examples, and I think your book, is very good in laying the groundwork for people thinking differently about these companies, because I think most people, especially younger people, mostly had pretty good associations with Google, Facebook, all of these large organizations that they help them connect and so forth, and they don't see them as actually dangerous to our democracy, and you got to make the case for why that's so. But just to start off the conversation, so I have a specific question about where we head from this point on, given how powerful they are. I would think that, if I were the king of the world, I would say, just like in the progressive era, U.S. Congress should, create another statute that updated the Sherman and Clayton Acts and break these companies up, essentially. But that's going to be very hard to do for a number of reasons. Part of it is intellectual, because a lot of people don't see the justification for doing this. There's a whole Wall Street Journal crowd that will say, in tech it doesn't matter because concentrated power never lasts. Look at what happened to IBM. They're gone just as a result of technological change. But also people just have positive views of the tech companies. But Donald Trump also makes this more complicated. Donald Trump would love to take on Amazon. He'd love to take on Facebook, because these companies don't like him. Mm-hmm. And he knows that. Mm-hmm. And it complicates the creation of a kind of coalition of people that think that this is a serious problem. And I'm just wondering whether you've thought further about, okay, so you take your book, you accept the conclusions, these companies are too big, they're a danger to democracy. How do we actually build the political willpower to do something about it?
So a lot's happened very quickly over the course of this last year, that at least at the elite level. So if you do public polling or focus groups with most of a random sampling of Americans, most of them would have a very favorable opinion of these companies. Probably a much more favorable opinion of these companies than any other set of companies, in fact. But at the elite level, something's happened in the last couple months where, and the Democratic Party has actually started to change in relation to these companies. So what's happened? Well, the elections happened. Strangely, Whole Foods, the Amazon's purchase of Whole Foods elicited a whole bout of anxiety about gigantism that we hadn't seen before. The New America incident, I think, actually helps call attention to the ways in which Google is now omnipresent. And even though Google poses as a neutral actor, it's actually going to use its power. As a virtue, it's going to use its power in order to enforce its corporate imperatives. And what's going to happen is really what you described with Donald Trump is the fascinating part of this moment. That, as we know, populism is a cross-cutting ideology, that it divides the left and it divides the right. And I think the same thing is going to happen when it comes to the questions of monopoly, that there's going to be part of the left that's going to go one way. Obama represents Obama had a vision of technological progress that led him to be a cheerleader for these companies. Google was the company that visited the Oval Office most during the Obama administration. Then you have the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, and increasingly even Chuck Schumer and very, very like people you wouldn't associate as firebrands, making the case that we have too much concentration of private power in this country, that the questions of inequality are related to the questions of corporate concentration. And so the question is, what's to be done? So if the politics are going to start to head in a direction where monopoly returns as an issue. Monopoly was, up until the 1950s, monopoly was always one of the biggest issues in American politics. It was an issue that you could wield to scare up votes, and it was always politically potent. But then it stopped being politically potent, and part of what happened is that was that there was a paradigm shift within American politics where you had Ralph Nader and you had the left really focusing on the consumer movement and consumer rights. And that just happened to coincide with a tricky rhetorical move that Robert Bork made and the right made, which was to say, all right, you're right, let's care about consumers above all else. And so when we focus on corporate size and the problem of monopoly, we're not going to care about the problem of monopoly so long as these corporations price things low. And so we've had a bipartisan consensus that's kind of eased into an ideal of antitrust that emphasizes consumer welfare. Consumer welfare is an inadequate paradigm for dealing with these companies because these companies are great for consumer welfare. Amazon's prices are low, and they get you your boxes of toilet paper and groceries within 2 hours or the next day. And Google is free and Facebook is free. You can't really, but the question is, how do we move that movement back to taking concerns of citizenship as an important part of that conversation, and also shifting part of the conversation from consumers to producers? Because part of the problem that Amazon poses is exactly what you described with Hachette, that to get low prices for readers, they basically squeezed the publishers, who in turn squeezed writers. And over the course of, I think, my career as a writer, I've seen how advances get paid out in smaller and smaller segments, extended over longer and longer periods of time. And maybe I'll monetize this book when my daughter graduates from college and like the 5th edition comes out, which is when I get my last payday for the book. But this is a condition that's problematic for democracy. Democracy needs good information. We need books, and and that's going to suffer. And so I think we need to rethink antitrust. We need to push it in a direction where it's not just wedded to notions of consumer of pricing and consumer welfare, or the definition of consumer welfare has to be expanded to include other concerns like privacy. And we need to think about our competition policy in a much more holistic sort of way. Up through the 1970s, we took action against monopolistic corporations on policy grounds. If we had concerns about the way a company was wielding its size, not just in terms of pricing, we took action against it. And in the history of communications, we've been especially vigilant about monopoly. And it goes back to the beginning of the Republic. The post office was the first communications monopoly. And the US government said, we don't want you extending your power into the telegraph business because we need to create space. It's too dangerous to have the lines of communication dominated by one private company. And then when Western Union got a monopoly in the telegraph business, government threatened to privatize it and threatened to combine it with the post office. And that scared the hell out of Western Union. And so Western Union didn't get in the telephone business. And then AT&T came to dominate the telephone business, and that was in the Teddy Roosevelt era. And they were so scared of the government that they basically entered into a truce with it, where they submitted to being regulated in a fairly invasive sort of way. And we didn't let them get into the radio business, and so on down the line through the Microsoft case, which is one of the most underrated cases, I think, in recent political history. Because if Microsoft didn't feel scared of the government, if Microsoft hadn't gone through this bruising case where the government they were actually, before the Bush administration came in and settled the matter, there was talk of dismembering Microsoft. And that scared Microsoft. And you know what the product of that fear was? Google. Google would have been strangled in its crib if there hadn't been a fear of government action. And so if we look at this long history, what you see is that, well, not only has the government done a pretty good job of trying to protect the public square and trying to protect communications, but you'd also say that the government's been a big prod to innovation. So you mentioned IBM. Well, IBM was subjected to antitrust cases starting in the 1950s, going up through the 1980s, and that hobbled IBM and created space for Microsoft. So that's my long rambling response.
Okay, good. So I think we should open the floor to other questions and comments. Yes.
Well, yeah, so just sort of sticking along this topic, I definitely agree with you about the power that some of these companies have, Google, Facebook. But I guess, like, how would you think about breaking them up? Because even with all the examples you just listed, I totally understand them and read separate books on that. But like Facebook, like we're using Facebook as an example, like, how do you break it up exactly? Do you have different websites depending on where you live and then how you access Facebook? Like,
Yeah.
And then because of the network effects, then people can in theory be like, okay, I'm going to use a VPN to log into Facebook in the Northeast because I like that one better. And so how do you block all that with the net neutrality aspect of things? You
Right.
don't want people meddling in because these companies are just so different than the companies of the past.
It's a very challenging question, and I don't have a great answer to it. But I think that each company you'd have to look at differently. So you could say, and this is really beyond my expertise, and so, but let me just throw out some ideas. So you could say that Google would have to carve out its search business from the rest of everything that it does, and break that into a separate company, and that would maybe hobble it significantly so that Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever could actually flourish. Because the problem is that when these companies amass these giant horizontal businesses where they keep getting into other areas, it's their comparative advantages build because it's based on AI and it's based on the collection of data. And so each additional business that you get in strengthens your core business. And so, or with Amazon controls something like 70% of the ebook market, 50% of the total book market. Historically, the definition of what constitutes a monopoly is a very slippery sort of one, but certainly once you get in the 70s range, that's a monopoly. You could say, all right, carve that piece of your business out from the rest. With Facebook, I think that one thing you'd want to do is you wouldn't necessarily, there's not necessarily an obvious way to break up Facebook, but the other aspect, there are two aspects of antitrust policy. There's mergers, and then there's the ability to break things up. You could be much more active in containing mergers. Right now, we let companies merge willy-nilly. We don't really put a whole lot of pressure on them. So if Facebook buys Oculus or buys something else, we don't look at it holistically about the way in which they may be building power going forward or the impact for markets going forward. So maybe if we were blue skying a much more activist policy, that's what we would focus on.
Yeah, and I also think that a lot of the reason they make these acquisitions of smaller companies is actually to stifle competition.
Yeah.
They simply don't want the threat from a startup that could, hurt
Yeah.
their business. Okay.
So similar to Microsoft, similar to IBM and companies in the past. And I think much of the work today is not technology, but media production in that sense, or creating content, or managing or editing content. So basically, they're doing your job. And I wonder if you have any idea of how, and that is a core aspect of them. Both Amazon, Facebook, Google, you manage what we view, what we read, but much more than the newspapers in the past did. And I was wondering how, with technology going into this direction, how can you actually separate these two things, which are very different, or is there any way of actually doing that? Because they're exercisal terms, and they're so it's a new. I don't know if we should think about them as a new category or at all, or but I wonder if you think of any ways to do it.
Right. So I think that part of it is a conceptual redefinition, which is that, and you see this concept. There's a problem and it's highlighted in the way that Mark Zuckerberg has responded to the fake news Russian advertising controversy, which is in journalism. There was a concept that developed in the 1950s as we were after World War II, when we started to get really concerned about how public opinion was formulated, how fascism is created. And so there, in the sociology departments, they came up with a term called gatekeepers. And gatekeepers were the powerful people who made the decisions about what rose to the top to the top of the front page and what wasn't covered. And so gatekeeping was kind of a concept that was born in that moment, but it also meshed with the kind of the WASP establishment that was running newspapers, running media at that time, and that was an elite that really thought of itself as having a sense of noblesse oblige. And so this is a very condescending attitude, but there was a sense that they had that they were giving their readers information that they needed to have that would make them better people. And we know all the things that are wrong with that old idea of gatekeeping, that the old gatekeepers could suck up to power and could be smug and self-important. But there was very much a self-consciousness about the power that they possessed. And it created some of the parts of journalism that I happen to like, which including objectivity, which grew out of that concept, but also a sense that newspapers should be held accountable in all sorts of little sort of ways, from having to publish corrections to having letters to the editor, et cetera, et cetera. Flash forward to Facebook or to Amazon. These companies masquerade as being the enemies of gatekeepers. Jeff Bezos spits on gatekeepers, or at least he did until he became the publisher of the Washington Post. And Mark Zuckerberg says, "I'm not a gatekeeper. I've just got this system with algorithms, and the algorithms are doing their thing, and there's really no humans involved here. Nobody's shaping this. This is just what people want." And then we get to something like the fake news controversy or Russian ads, and he's stuck having to explain how he created a system that's doing all these horrible things that he doesn't really control. And so conceptually for us, I think it's important for us to realize, all right, even if algorithms do play this important role in sorting information, these companies are the most powerful gatekeepers in human history. And with that means that they have power and certain responsibilities.
Okay, why don't we go over here?
As I understood from your speech, Facebook is some kind of challenge or even enemy for journalism. And partly I agree with this statement. But can you imagine any situation when Facebook can help journalists, especially in so-called emerging democracies? I can explain a little bit. I'm JSK fellow from Russia. It sounds like paradox to be journalist from Russia, but anyway. The situation with Facebook in Russia is absolutely different from American one. For example, Facebook maybe is the only one platform which provides the opportunity for free speech in Russia. So, but how can journalists benefit from it? That's my question.
Well, I think that it's pretty obvious from recent history that Facebook has when it proclaims its emancipatory powers, that's not just hype. I mean, it has. If we look at kind of the narratives of the Arab Spring or some of the later color revolutions or successors of the color Maidan began on Facebook. That's not. It provided an opportunity, and it was outside of the control of the state and maybe conventional media apparatuses that are subjected to the state, and we don't want it to disappear for that reason. And this is kind of my point, is that just because we can identify some of the problems with these technologies and these platforms doesn't mean that we need to stamp them out of existence. We need to be able to shape them in a way that they can more fully realize their potential. But and the question that you asked, I don't really have a great specific example. I don't know enough about journalism in Russia other than to do it, you have to be very brave.
Okay, let's go back over here. How about Jack?
Hi. So I studied journalism and public policy, but I study applied mathematics. So a lot of people here, software engineers and data scientists, we aspire working for Google, or we want to open a startup or something. So what's your suggestion for people like us? Because this is a bit like Silicon Valley, right?
So I've thought about this. I've thought about this a little bit in the context of my own daughter. And so I have a 12-year-old daughter, and like most 12-year-olds, I mean, I think that she's biologically, magnetically attracted to technology. And there's part of me that as I watch her code, learn how to code, that I tell myself, go be a poet. Go be a philosopher. The world, everybody else in the world is coding right now. But what about these other? But then as I've turned this around in my head, I've thought, you know what? Actually, what the world needs are computer scientists who are able to think as human beings. And that part of, I'm going to say something that's going to sound, that'll probably get me in trouble. But part of the engineering mentality is to create systems that are efficient and that work well and that have beautiful internal logic. And that's important, and the world needs that. But as computer science has become everything, that means that computer scientists are designing systems that have ethical dimensions and human dimensions and political and moral dimensions. And so I think it's really important that we find a way to liberate computer science from the computer scientist, and that we find a way to engineer engineering so that that the mentality becomes bigger and that the education becomes more well-rounded. And when I don't really know much about starting up companies, but the one thing that is clear from the economics that I've looked at in the studies is that we don't start up as many companies as we once did, and that part of the problem is that talent gets sucked up by the big firms, and ambition gets sucked up by the big firms too, because it's harder to be an entrepreneur if you can't imagine displacing the big guys. And so in a way, we do need people to swing for the fences.
Hey, how about down at the end? Yeah.
Hi, so I'll talk to you. I think my social circle is very self-selecting in nature. So like if I go on social media, I will most likely see articles of very voices inside. And I think a lot of people in my generation, particularly at certain universities like Stanford, often go through that struggle. So what can these social media companies or news organizations do to sort of bridge that increasingly polarized gap and allow people from my age or older institutions to really feel these ideas outside their social circle?
I would turn that back on you, which is that part of the problem is that we expect that these companies will solve some problem for us, that they'll do a better job of curating our world for us, or that they'll give us a more diverse array of information than they're giving us now. But not to be a scold, but I mean, it's on us really to do that for ourselves. That part of what we need to do is we need to be more active in curating and aggregating our own media diet. We need to make decisions that take a little bit more work, but where we tend to ourselves. One of the heroes in my book is Louis Brandeis, who was a great Supreme Court justice. And the reason that he's a hero in my book is that he came up, not only was he the great trust buster, but he also came up with our idea of privacy. And for him, privacy and monopoly were problems that he considered in tandem. That monopoly was something that he worried about because of its impact on citizens, that he worried that it's going to sound very arcane, and it is arcane. It doesn't really translate, but he was worried that if you worked for an all-powerful firm, eventually you would just vote the way that the all-powerful firm told you to vote. So that sounds conspiratorial, but like if you worked for the Koch brothers would probably, you'd exist in a culture where the Koch brothers would want you to vote a certain sort of way. In early industrial America, that's not an absurd fear to have. And he treasured a world where people had independence, and economic independence was part of it, that you should be able to move from job to job to be able to fulfill yourself and not feel this sense that you're locked into one place. And privacy was similarly connected to this idea, because he thought that you couldn't be a good citizen if you weren't able to think for yourself. And so, and that his worry with privacy is that when we're watched, we stop to be able to, it's much more difficult to be an independent thinker, because when you're watched, you can't kick around a bad idea or a subversive idea because you're afraid of being embarrassed about that idea. Or you start to think, you're thinking about your audience when you're watched. And so you start formulating ideas to appeal to the person who's watching you. And he had a concept that he talked about a lot in Supreme Court decisions. And he actually said it was the highest end of the state, which is that we needed to create conditions where citizens can develop their faculties, which he meant that we need to create conditions where people, regular people, can think, have space to think, have the ability to keep improving themselves, because the quest to improve yourself becomes the thing that makes it possible for you to make a good decision in a democracy. And it's sappy, but it's true, because one of the things that's happened in this recently, I think, is that the quality of information that flows to the everyday person has really been diminished, and they make worse decisions, even as the problems that we ask them to consider become ever more complicated. So do it. Go find the the conservative or the flaming left-wing thing that forces you to reconsider your own opinions.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Franklin. As a journalist, I simply cannot agree more with you. I mean, with the reality that you just described. But I wonder why we are not seeing more of consumer revolt around us. I think that antitrust communication history basically is teaching us that there's always that component that was important. So why we are not seeing more of revolt users and consumers against this technology?
Well, in part because it's free and it's easy and it's efficient, and they have data that leads them to give us exactly what we want. I mean, we're also locked into systems that part of the whole theory of the case with Google or Facebook or Amazon. Amazon has Prime, and so once you sign up for Prime, it becomes automatic to use Amazon. Once you use Gmail and Google Docs, it's impossible to imagine migrating to some other system. Facebook allows you to validate your identity at any number of places, and it's created this global telephone directory. Why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? And so it's just hard to imagine ever wanting to leave.
Okay, how about here?
Yeah, I guess one of the recurring themes of your talk has been the need to have change happen. I guess kind of building off the previous question, change to happen sort of like the uppermost echelons where like essentially government has to come in as big brother and decide, hey, here's a stick, we're going to beat up Google a little bit and say, you know, you're getting too big for the good of the public. And I'm wondering kind of on the idea of why aren't consumers revolting? I mean, is there any hope of like kind of a grassroots sort of like a, I don't want to say uprising, like a revolution here necessarily, but something where, you know, there is something that everyday people can do collectively, and if change can in some way originate from kind of like more grassroots fashion to also, I mean, you know, tackle some of these problems.
I think that, look, there's a lot of free-floating anger right now that could be directed in productive sort of ways, and that requires political leadership that understands the kind of the truest sources of why people are frustrated, and then tries to find, like I said, productive ways of channeling that anger. But I think a lot of this really begins at an elite level. There's an analogy that's a big part of my book, which is to food. That 50 years ago, we had processed food that emerged, TV dinners, and it seemed incredible because there were no longer pots and pans to clean. You didn't have to go shopping every day. And then 50 years later, we woke up and we realized, holy crap, this stuff was engineered to make us fat, and it completely rearranged the whole economy of food production and led to all this concentration. And I think something similar has happened to the things that we ingest through our mind. And while that is an extremely pessimistic, deeply dark analogy, I do think that there's something optimistic in it, which is that when it comes to food, at least, at an elite level, in a way that I think has trickled down slowly through the culture, people have begun to make better choices about what they eat. That there are people who've decided that they're going to sacrifice efficiency in low prices for a product that's more virtuous, that's perceived to be better for you. And so I think it's possible to imagine a world in which the same sort of thing happens with knowledge and culture and media.
Okay.
So I really applaud the statement because like broadening computer science and people just take in it and what type of knowledge or type of insight are required for building successful technology. And I'm also in favor of looking at anti-monopoly or antitrust regulation to deal with some of the issues that been like really large companies. But on the other hand, I'm kind of concerned about the nature of the technology itself and you said something at the start where you said our intellectual functions are being moderated by this technology, and you distinguish that from past technologies.
Yeah.
You say the same thing about like language moderates our intellectual
Automated, I think is what I said.
But that this feels in some way different from that. And if that's true, then I think there's a strong argument to be made that there's the politics of the technology itself, that the fact that these systems function better when you give them more information about yourself in one perspective, or that they often result in complexity that even engineers who build them.
Yes.
So if that's the case, and they're not taking away the responsibility from people, Mark Zuckerberg, of like trying to actively manage some of the impacts of the system, but if that technology is at a level where it's actually leading to a certain type of intellectual engagement that is maybe is against democracy and is against intellectual engagement, is against deep civic engagement and more these sort of easy interactions, it seems like unlikely to me that government intervention is enough to address that from technology itself.
I endorse your remarks. I think that that's totally true. I mean, and just think about, I think about this with the phone, which is the most obvious example, which is that I shudder to think about how many times a day I check my phone. And I know that there is this app Moment that you can use to check, to monitor phone usage, but I almost don't want to install it because I think I would be so horrified at the results. And the phone is an addictive piece of technology. It's designed to keep us checking. And there is almost a biological impulse that we have, but it's not, it's deeply psychological. This fear of missing out, this fear that there's somebody's loving you or hating you or wants to tell you something that's critically important at this moment and that you can't wait another second to see it. And even though you know you probably shouldn't do it, you're gonna, and the question of how do we as human beings navigate technology that is so great, so addictive, so liberating, so enslaving, and how do we create spaces for ourselves to be disconnected from the machine, at least for parts of our day, where we achieve the state of self-awareness that you're talking about our relationship to it, but also where we focus on other things. And this is also going to sound a little bit sappy, but one of the things that I found most encouraging in the last couple of years is the survival of the paper book. So the Kindle, when it came on the scene, was meant to herald the death of the book as we knew it, as it's existed since Gutenberg. That everybody said that ebooks were going to do away with paper books because it was simply better. When you wanted it, you didn't have to carry around these heavy things. And you know what? The paper book is still here. And ebook sales have flatlined. Paper book sales have actually increased in the last couple of years. Independent bookstores have not gone away. The fact that there are no Barnes & Noble and Borders has actually created space for independent bookstores, and they've started to sprout up in other places. And I don't think that there's a conscious reason why this has happened. Part of it has to do with the pricing, that when Apple aligned with the publishers, they were able to ultimately push back against Amazon's race to the bottom with pricing. So most ebooks are now priced very, very close to the price of hardcover books, which is different than the rest of media. Publishing seized control of its own destiny and tried to preserve the value, the underlying economic value of its product. And I think they're gonna reap the benefits from that over the long run. But more than that, I think as human beings, we know that we live our lives on screens, and we know that we need a break from that. at a certain point. And what reading is the quintessential private act. And when you're reading on a paper book, you're not umbilically connected to a corporate store. You're not subjected to constant notifications and distractions. You're engaged with text. And it's a moment where you actually can contemplate the world, where you're withdrawn from everything. I mean, when I read, I think there's a reason people read paper books in their most private spaces. People read in bed, people read in the bath, people read in their den where they're kind of closed off from the rest of the world, because it requires a certain sort of concentration and focus, and it demands a lot of us as human beings. And so I think we need to look for those sorts of spaces where we're still human.
Vinyl records are making a comeback too, so I like that. Yes, how about? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Susan. I am an ex-journalist like you, and I'm working for one of the communications departments at Stanford today. So my quick tip on not being addicted to the phone is move countries, don't get a calling plan, and only be able to check it when you have Wi-Fi. It's great. But I agree on the problems around this sort of concentration of information through these big companies. I just feel that there's one thing that struck me this week over which I read in the New York Times yesterday, the Eric Reed piece, 49ers, about his relationship with Colin Kaepernick, and how nobody picked up that Colin Kaepernick was kneeling until he'd done it at least 3 times, and then somebody from the media spotted it, and then it became like the Cecil the Lion, but in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, where you can see that there are opportunities, because this, like, the bad side of the concentration of information through these tech companies is not going to go away. So, what do you suggest that people can start doing at a, like, individual, group, whatever it is, level, to kind of, like, seize the narrative and, like, push against it? I know it's a bit of a David and Goliath situation, but like, there's an example, I think, of something positive which came up, everybody writing the same thing, or different angles on it.
Well, I'm not against news, and I think that, you know, there are events that happen in the world that deserve, as you say, to like receive widespread attention and deserve to be a point of convergence for conversation. I think editors and reporters have a responsibility to. We live in a world of data. There's no avoiding data, and no avoiding Facebook. But I think there's a way in which you have to be true to yourself in a way that data interferes with in terms of our professional practice. And as users, there's so much about clicking on the web that's almost subconscious, that when you get into a trance-like state, when you're on your phone or you're on your laptop and you're clicking through things, personally, sometimes I don't make a conscious decision to go read the next thing. I just led there by the headline or the photo, and it's like Malcolm Gladwell's Blink decisions, or it's like behavioral economics, where there's a whole choice architecture that's being set up for us. And I think part of it's just is self-awareness. The one thing that I found, I accidentally stumbled into a parenting thing with my kids that I found to be reasonably effective. I can't claim that there was genius behind the design, but my daughter wanted to watch a documentary called Fed Up, which is a Katie Couric documentary about childhood obesity, and it's about the way that addiction forms with food, and the ways in which food is created in such a way that where sugar is added and it's manipulated, it's reverse engineered in order to keep us coming back for more. And once you start to understand that that's the way that the world works, and I don't mean to totally knock it. Capitalism requires marketing, advertising, and the creation of addictive products to a certain extent. But when the addiction is so powerful and when it's so hidden, it becomes problematic. And so just understanding, with my kids, just understanding that's the way that the world works. And I tried to explain the way that technology is like Doritos. That if you don't think about it, you're gonna keep going back to the bag, and next thing you know, you've shoveled away a whole bag of Cool Ranch Doritos, and you've got diabetes. And so, I mean, the same is true with technology, where if you don't aspire for moderation, if you don't aspire for self-awareness with it, it'll end up controlling you.
Okay. I have two quick questions. Your book is about existential, right? Which company is the most dangerous in your view? Facebook, Google, and maybe Amazon? And I have another question for both of you. Actually, a lot of people are talking about regulating these companies as utilities. What do you think of this idea? And can you think of an applicable model for this type of regulation?
So, all right. So the hierarchy of evil. In my mind, it's Facebook is the most dangerous.
I agree. Yeah.
Second most dangerous is Amazon. Simply just because of their octopus quality and the way in which and I also think that there's a race to the bottom that they're creating where we're reaping the benefits from it in the short term, but over the long term, it's going to be really problematic. An example is Whole Foods. Oh, it seems great. Amazon's bought Whole Foods. They're slashing prices at Whole Foods. That's great. I can get the Bulgarian feta that I never was able to afford before. Well, how is that going to work out over the long run? Like, if you're dealing with artisanal producers, if you're dealing with a peach farmer in Pennsylvania who's integrated himself into the Whole Foods supply chain that involves his peaches getting sold at $2.50 a bushel when the price gets cut to $1.25. Where's that savings going to come from? Maybe in part it'll come from increased volume, but eventually that cost reduction is going to get passed on to the producer. And then I'd say Google is the third, where I'm actually filled with a lot of admiration. In writing this book, I decided that the best reporting I could do was simply to watch YouTube footage of Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Page and Jeff Bezos, to the extent that it exists, and listen to them, because they say profoundly interesting things about human nature, about social organization, about community, about the future of technology. And Larry Page I found to be, in some ways, the most brilliant of these titans of tech. In some ways, the most scary, because there's a theological intensity.
So can you give an example of that?
Well, so Larry Page believes that if we engineer the world in the correct sort of way, we can live in a world of abundance, and that it's just about applying rationality to the distribution of goods and to the organization of society. I mean, that's a classic. It's almost like out of Auguste Comte, right? It's this idea that you can engineer your way to a perfect world. But also, the other great example of that is that they talk about the merger of man and machine in a fairly explicit sort of way, and about our cyborg future. And it's done in such a way that I find unnerving, simply because it's done with the utmost confidence about how it's going to end up working out for the best for us. Oh, the utility question. I'm interested to know what Frank has to say about this.
Well, I think you could, the big problem is going to be innovation. That anything you regulate like a utility is going to innovate like a utility, which is not very much. But there's certainly, parts of the company, of all these companies, where you could hive off, a certain function that they perform, like, Frank's suggestion about the search function being turned into a separate company, and then, try to regulate those pieces. But the trick is that you don't actually want to kill innovation.
Right.
right? And so you gotta figure out how to get the boring parts, under control and allow the exciting ones to go ahead.
There's another thing that concerns me about that model, which is that we're talking about information. It's one thing to have the state play a role in regulating a telephone company or an electric grid, but it's quite another to have them regulate the way that a search engine functions and tries to sort through the world of information. Where would the possibilities for abuse, I think, are inherent there. So when Donald Trump even if there was an independent commission, say a regulatory commission regulating it, Donald Trump's president, and somehow is able to appoint somebody to that commission and starts railing about things. It feels dangerous to me in a way that I can never quite get comfortable with the concept.
Is there a pattern in which regulation tends to kill innovation? Historically speaking.
It always kills regulation. I mean, always kills innovation.
I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think that at least with antitrust, there's a pretty great history of antitrust regulation.
Well, that, yeah.
Creating competition and innovation.
If you take the telecommunication industry, that's not obvious, I would say. I'm not sure it was beneficial for the innovation of AT&T, Bell, and so on, that it was actually regulated and for the top.
Well, I think that they made the wrong choice with regulating AT&T. That the better choice is to break it up. Mm-hmm. That if they'd applied antitrust laws to AT&T, that would have unleashed innovation. But keeping it in this regulatory utility structure, I think that did stamp down innovation.
The biggest difference is that today is going to be some kind of global regulation, in which, for instance, Europe will have an important role to play, which might change the very nature of the regulation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, maybe this will be the last question.
Looking at the previous question about trying to reduce your involvement in the echo chamber of social media, because there's not that much incentive or motivation for most people to try to seek out political opinions other than their own, what would you suggest as in starting sort of a mass movement towards that type of seeking knowledge?
Let me answer this in a roundabout way because I'm not sure I have the silver bullet. But one thing that annoys me is the criticism of the New York Times op-ed page. It's pretty widespread. So the New York Times op-ed page makes choices that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. I wouldn't necessarily publish an op-ed by Eric Prince on Afghanistan. I wouldn't necessarily make the same choices that they make in terms of hiring columnists. But while I would disagree with some of the individual choices, I think it's vitally important that we have spaces like that where you're subjected to lots of opinions that sometimes make you want to chuck your laptop across the room in anger, because that's important to formulating good opinions. You get tested all the time there. You have to argue with, if you're a conservative, you have to argue with Paul Krugman. If you hate David Brooks, you have to formulate a reason for hating David Brooks. I think that's actually a pretty crucial space to preserve, and I worry that right now we need to figure. There are these big questions about speech that are very unnerving to us, because it's unnerving to see hate on display in the way that it's on display right now. It's unnerving to live in Donald Trump's America. Forgive me if anybody in this room disagrees with me, but it's unnerving when there's the possibility of mass deportation. It's unnerving when you see the president trying to kind of bully people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I understand why there's maybe a gravitation towards a more European understanding of speech, and there is an important debate to be had there. But I think that over the long run, we can survive. We will survive Donald Trump's. I hope we will survive Donald Trump's America. I can't guarantee it, I mean, there's no way to guarantee it. I'm sorry to say, but I do think that to me, Donald Trump represents the short-term peril and the long-term peril. The short-term peril I've just described, but the long-term peril is that we create new structures for regulating speech, regulating companies that, when in the hands of a Donald Trump-like figure, get turned on the rest of us.
Okay, so that was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good.
Hey, so great to see you.